Welcome to today's session. I'm Dr. Ashnoor Nagji, so delighted to be with you here, albeit virtually, to talk about a really fun topic. I'm a family doctor, I deliver babies, and I'm here to share a little bit about labor and delivery 101, so I hope you enjoy. So for today, we'll go through a couple of overview topics on how to prepare yourself for labor 101. The big one that folks always ask is about pain management, and then also things on thinking about where you might deliver in the hospital that you might deliver. So, you know, the number one piece around being pregnant and thinking about your labor and delivery is, gosh, what do I need to do to be prepared? So one of the first things, and I often find this so interesting that this decision, this exploration is often sort of not done as mindfully as one could do it, and that is the choice of care providers. Here in BC, we have a really robust maternity network of providers, and I often find it really interesting that some of my friends don't actually even know what I do. They think that I'm an OB. When I was working overseas with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, they thought I was a midwife. Like this notion that family doctors can do deliver babies sometimes is a bit of a surprise to people. So I think one of the first things about being prepared is about mindfully choosing your care provider. And so when we're talking about groups of providers, and hopefully that ambulance in the background is not rushing to a laborer, but there's groups of providers. So you have physicians, and in the physician category, you have obstetricians that are specialists in maternity care. And then you have family doctors, and many of us have extra expertise, training, and experience and interest in the maternity care journey. And so in terms of physicians, you have family docs and OBs, and then you have another category of care providers referred to as midwives, and then you have your allied health, and usually in that you have the supportive folks who offer that one-on-one support, usually during the actual labor and delivery, and they're referred to as doulas, or in the Indigenous tradition, birth keepers. So, you know, oftentimes people get a bit overwhelmed with all the things that they need to kind of be aware of. One of it is just knowing your own history. So, you know, how many pregnancies have you had? And losses do count as the number of times you've been pregnant. Any complications that you had with any previous pregnancies? Was there some postpartum bleeding? Did your baby need some support to help breathe after the birth? These are good things to kind of know, because oftentimes this gives us a sense of what we might be able to expect in this pregnancy and labor and delivery as well. Other things to know is about the current pregnancy. Are you on any medications? Have you had vaccinations? Have you had your COVID vaccinations? Have you had the whooping cough or Adacel? Those kinds of things, any previous complications like I mentioned. The other thing about this is your mood. How has your mood been? Has it been fluctuating up and down, or is it relatively stable? And oftentimes partners or loved ones can offer some additional insights into this. Later in the pregnancy, we do a swab for what's called Group B strep. So Group B streptococcus, about 1 in 3 women carry it. It's really no consequence to the pregnant person itself, but where it does play an important role is that if you are GBS or Group B strep positive, then oftentimes we start antibiotics right once your water breaks to support baby as baby's coming down that birth canal. And so what that often means is that you can't labor at home for as long as you might have been able to labor if you were GBS negative. And so knowing that is really key. The other status to know is what's called your RH status. Are you positive or negative? Because that has different implications as well. Some women are very aware of all the things they want and how they would like their labor and delivery to go. And oftentimes what we try and do is we capture that in what's called a birth plan. In the birth plan, you can put things like, the kinds of music that you want to have, perhaps some type of ambiance setting, who you want to have in the room, whether or not you want to have pain medications, what that kind of looks like, any specific cultural practices or ceremony that you might want to consider, and sort of having these thoughts before the big day is always a good idea, and then writing them down and letting your team of providers know, whether that's your obstetrician, your family doctor, the midwife, also the doulas or birth keepers, your family, the nurses. Kind of having everybody on the same page is kind of helpful, and we usually do that through the birth plan. You may have seen these pregnancy passports. You might see in the top right there, our Sacred Journey. This is from the Perinatal Services of BC. This pregnancy passport, it's called, is designed for the Indigenous First Nations communities, but I really like it because it's really holistic. It not only talks about, your blood pressure, your weight, your weeks of pregnancy, as you can see on this bottom chart here, but it also kind of goes into some questions around your philosophy, ideas that you have, things like your spiritual and cultural considerations, which I think are really important on this beautiful journey that you're embarking on. Of course, the big question is, what do I pack? And for the loved ones who are kind of supporting you, and we often see this in Hollywood movies where people are rushing into the hospital and they're like, oh my God, where do we park? And so that's always a good thing to know beforehand, before the big day. In terms of decisions, we've talked about the type of maternity care provider, and that's a really important one, I think, right at the onset, or even as you're considering to become pregnant. Prenatal classes is another really big one, and in the landscape of the pandemic, a lot of these have gone online and become virtual, and so that's something to consider. And then another key decision point is whether or not and what type of prenatal genetic testing or screening that you might want to have. So, part of the pregnancy journey, the maternity journey, particularly I think for us in our tradition, is that it's holistic, right? So we talked a little bit about your mood earlier. There's lots of pieces to unpack in that, thinking about your thoughts and your feelings, the stories of birth that you've heard about, but sometimes there's mixed emotions. Folks aren't feeling, as excited as they think they should, or maybe this wasn't a planned pregnancy, or maybe the timing is not great, or there's other circumstances. Maybe there's a pandemic that's happening. So lots of things to kind of think about. So your body, mind, and spirit are really a key component of how you journey through this important phase. And so again, this is drawn from the pregnancy passport, and you can kind of see how keeping all of these things balanced in the Indigenous culture, they have the medicine wheel, but of course in Arcturica, the notion of Ardin and Dunya is really critical. And the idea that another soul is coming through you and into your life, and what does that mean? And so really taking some time to consider what this journey means for you and your additional one that's arriving on the planet. So, I have mentioned the pandemic pregnancies piece a bit, and I can tell you that people have been pregnant, obviously. Their numbers have gone up in the pandemic. And so, that in the context of sort of what's happening around us, and albeit hopefully now we're receding from sort of those earlier moments of lockdown and a time when there was a lot of stressors on individuals and the institutions in general. But, things are ever changing with COVID in the hospital. And so something to kind of consider before you deliver is checking in to see what the current policy, what the current regulations are, and knowing that your team of doctors and midwives and nurses are really trying to offer you the best care possible. Of course, notwithstanding a pandemic, pregnancy is time for lots of questions and mixed emotions, and that's all normal. And it's good to be able to articulate your questions, your concerns, your thoughts with others, and also to check out reliable resources on Dr. Google. I've listed one here, pregnancyvancouver.ca/COVID-19 pregnancy. And I was really fortunate to be a part of creating this website along with a team of obstetricians, family doctors, midwives, but also patients and doulas, mental health counselors. And so, the information that you're seeking, perhaps at 3 o'clock in the morning, you want to make sure that it's reliable information, because these friends of ours often tell us lots of things that can be really helpful, but sometimes may not be sort of the most current. So keeping that in mind as you start to explore and think through some of the questions that you have. So let's move into Labor 101. Always lots of questions on this, particularly sometimes I get these questions really early on in the visits. Somebody's just found out that they're pregnant and they're like, doctor, am I going to have a C-section? Am I going to have a vaginal birth? Lots of these questions that we do address in due course, but that, you might be starting to think through. So what is a normal labor? So we have painful contractions that happen regularly, and that through these contractions, the effect is dilation on your cervix. And that's really important because you can have contractions, but if the contractions are not the right intensity, the right frequency, they don't allow for the cervix to dilate, which is really like the door opening so that baby can, start to come out. So when we look at pregnancies, about 50% of pregnant people go into spontaneous labor and delivery, meaning that they don't need to have any additional interventions to try and, serve the notice of now is the time for labor to start. But sometimes, in other cases, we need to, what I often call, serve the eviction notice and say, knock, knock, it's time for you to come on out. And that can happen in a variety of ways. We can augment a labor that's kind of, sort of starting, but needs a little bit of a push. Or, baby's in there and says, you've made the great home for me, I'm kind of not leaving. And we need to sort of woo baby to come out, and that's often through the induction process. Sometimes things are already on their way and we need to assist, and that assistance can be through forceps or a vacuum. And sometimes in certain cases, we need to find another way of welcoming baby into this world, and sometimes that is through what's called the C-section, which is, as many of you know, a surgery. So this is, from some work that Friedman had done in the 50s, became popularized in the 70s, and this sort of normal labor curve shows that for your first delivery, that on average, once you're in what's called active labor, then we would expect about 0.5 to 1 centimeter change in your cervix every hour, versus if your body's done this before, this is your second, third, your fifth baby, then we're expecting that curve will be a lot faster. And this just gives us a sense of, are you on track? Are things mobilizing as we're expecting, or are things slowing down and we need to kind of stop and say, why is this not moving as we would expect? And we'll get into that shortly. So things sometimes don't move in the way that we want them to, these sort of slower labors, the medical term being dystocia, not kind of moving along as we expect, usually are because of 3 main reasons. And you see those there, the 3 Ps we call them. So power, so the uterus is contracting, but maybe not contracting as often as it needs to. So maybe it's contracting and then kind of taking a bit of a break and then contracting, or maybe it's not contracting as long as it needs to. So it's contracting, but the contractions are lasting, 10 seconds. And maybe they're not as strong as they need to. And I often use the example of toothpaste. So if you're trying to get toothpaste out, you got to squeeze it the right place with the right amount of pressure, for the right amount of time for the toothpaste to come out. And although a baby's not like Crest or Colgate, this notion of the uterus doing its work is really important, because that's kind of how the cervix does then change. And as you've heard on Hollywood, you got to get to 10 centimeters for things to happen, the door to be sort of fully open. Once the door is open, we might have a passenger on board that kind of looks like this, this one. And so if the passenger's bigger, then obviously trying to navigate through the pelvis is going to be a challenge. The pelvis itself, so bony structures and the amount of space that you have, can also dictate how the labor journey kind of goes. And I often talk about parking spots, right? So if you've got sort of a big truck trying to get into sort of a small space, it's going to be a bit tricky. And if you have like a small car and lots of space, then maybe that'll happen a bit more seamlessly. And so just things to consider when we're talking about labor not going sort of as planned. So when we're talking about early labor, what are the signs? So oftentimes when labor is just starting, contractions are happening, but they're not as regular. They're not as rhythmic as we like them to see. It's sort of just gradually starting. And I often talk about driving standard. So you kind of get into first gear and you're kind of starting to mobilize, but you haven't really gotten that momentum. And once you go into what's called active labor, you have this regular consistency, frequency, duration, intensity of the contractions, which allow for the cervical change. And this we often refer to as the 5-1-1 rule. So, are you having contractions every 5 minutes? Is each contraction lasting for 1 full minute? And does that all happen over 1 hour? So 5-1-1. And oftentimes we use that to say, in early labor, are you in this pattern yet? Because if you're not, then we want you to stay at home. So long as you're feeling baby move, this is the place for you to be. There's lots and lots of data to reaffirm that staying at home in early labor is the place to be, less likely to have interventions, less likely to have outcomes that are not positive. And so, you want to stay at home as long as you can in that early phase. Sometimes while you're at home, you might see what's called bloody show or the mucus plug. You might have some loose stools. This is all really normal. You want to make sure that along the way that you're feeling baby move. And we talked a little bit about your water breaking. Your water can break, and it can, vary from a little trickle to like that Olympic-sized pool gushing forward and getting everything in the way, the bed sheet and the bed and all the rest of that. So it really depends and varies from person to person. And again, if you're GBS or group B strep negative, then you're welcome to stay at home throughout that time. And what are you doing while you're staying at home? You're staying at home and you're trying to rest as much as possible. You're, trying to gather your energy, because getting to that 10 centimeters is going to be work, but then thereafter actually is going to be where more of the work starts. And, having some folks around, your loved ones, to support you would be lovely, if that's a possibility. And then, eating when you're hungry and drinking when you're thirsty in that early labor is totally okay. It's totally acceptable. And, you just want to try and mobilize, find those positions that work best for you, find where you're the most comfortable, and do what you need to do. And sometimes shower, massage, or TENS would be something that you might want to also think about to try and make sure that you're comfortable at that point. So as things progress, people often ask, well, what position should I be in? And oftentimes your body will guide you. It'll guide you intuitively to say, Right now, it feels great to be lying on my back. Oh, actually, I kind of want to move to my side. I want to use a ball. I want to use a chair. I want to lean over things. And we're going through some positions that you might want to consider along the way, but kind of just being really in tune with your body and seeing where you're getting the most amount of comfort. Positions are also really important as the labor progresses, and sometimes your provider may ask you to, roll over onto your hands and knees, for example, for a little bit, or be on one side versus the other to try and mobilize as baby's coming down and allowing again for that dilation. So here you can see, using some props, whether the props are pillows or chairs or people and using them as support along the way. But you can see that there's a lot of variety. Walking is really great if you're able to do that early in the pregnancy, particularly before early in the labor, particularly before you get hooked up to machines or epidurals and things like that, things to consider earlier on. So when we're talking about positions, the semi-sitting or side-lying positions are also ones that we use quite a bit. And, again, it's not that you use just one all the way through. It's thinking of the ones that are the most comfortable for you and also what we're trying to get baby to do as sort of baby's trying to navigate that birth canal. These squatting positions, you can see sort of on the top right, the bar there. We often use that to allow for women to try being in different positions. That one on the bottom looks a bit involved, but so you can kind of, depending on your circumstance. I know one of the first babies I delivered was in Guyana in South America, and their practice was to squat. They would use a hammock, and the women would deliver babies themselves at home. Yes, actually, by themselves. They would just get a whole bunch of, sweaters and cloths and put the clothes underneath them. And then lean against the hammock and then squat down and then bear down. And so lots of different cultures have different ways in which the laboring positions are sort of accepted and perhaps even taught generation for generation. But you might see some of these different positions along the way. And I know when I was in Uganda, when I was trying to ask some of the women to go on hands and knees, that was a position that many women looked very confused about. And so, sometimes these might be intuitive and taught, and then other times, not really part of the cultural practice. So kneeling, hands and knees, we just talked about that. Oftentimes, this is good to try and rotate baby or move baby in different ways, or if your cervix is dilating but not dilating evenly, I'll often use this position. And again, I'll use this position particularly if people are able to move, like you need to kind of have some strength in your lower legs at this point, if the epidural hasn't kicked in, because oftentimes when the epidural is in and it's a thick, heavy epidural where you're getting lots of pain relief, oftentimes you lose that motor function in your lower legs. And so the kneeling position may not become available to us later on. And so oftentimes earlier on, I try and get people to try these different positions. And also once you've kind of tried it before, then when somebody comes and says to you, oh, can you kneel? You're like, oh yes, I kind of know how to navigate and roll myself over, and I've already done this before. And so, again, trying these different positions out before. So we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier about labor support and doulas or birth keepers. And, the notion of having a continuous presence of a partner, a loved one, family friend, or, somebody that you hire, a professional doula or birth keeper, is very much part of many cultures and practices. And we know that this is actually supported by the literature. The evidence shows us that people who are pregnant, women, are more likely to have a vaginal delivery if they are supported by another person who is present during the labor, and that they're less likely to use pain medications and less likely to view the childbirth as a negative experience. And so, something to consider, again, linking it back to that birth plan. Is there somebody in particular that you would love to have there? And, it may or may not be your partner. It may or may not be somebody that you're related to. I mean, really, it's somebody that you think in that moment that they're going to be there cheerleading you on and supporting you holistically. And so, giving that some thought beforehand is always, a great idea. So pain management, the big question, can I get an epidural? And some people are like that, they're pregnant and right away, or they're kind of coming to that end of term of their pregnancy and they're like, I want the epidural. And some people are saying, what, actually, I just want to kind of see how this goes. And, both are okay. And the question is, how much are we going to use and when? Which tool do we use? And we want to make sure that the tool is necessary. We don't need to sort of overkill when we have space to try some other options. And so, what are some of those options? We just talked about bedside support and comfort measures. That's a very important one, and it shouldn't be underestimated, I think. Hydrotherapy is just a fancy way of saying showers, hot water, whether that's the tub or, a handheld that you're holding or somebody else is holding for you. Entonox is the laughing gas, and it kind of looks like, if those of you who've gone diving before, you kind of put it in your mouth and breathe in and out through your mouth. I can tell you some women love this. Like, they actually want to bottle it up and take it home. They love it. And others, not so much. They kind of feel a bit like seasick, a bit nauseous, and they don't really feel like it does a whole lot for them. My advice would be to try it. Don't knock it out of the park yet, and try it and see if that works for you. And you can always give it a couple of inhalations and say, oh, okay, actually this is working for me. And another thing to consider is sometimes even using this when you're having an exam done. So if the provider's coming to check and see how much you're dilated and it's really uncomfortable for you, you can ask for the Entonox and see if that gives you a bit of takes the edge off when the exams are being done. During the pandemic, at a certain point, we weren't using this because of concerns around spread of particles, but I believe most hospitals now are backing up and running with the Entonox. Sterile water injections, the idea is that it kind of triggers the pain gate theory and offsets pain in that way. I'd have to say I don't see it used very much. I know the midwives tend to use this quite a bit, some of them, and so something to think about. And then sort of your heavier products, if you will, are the narcotics, morphine and fentanyl, shorter acting things that we may give at the beginning when you're in early pregnancy. We want you early labor and we want you to go home and rest. Might give you a bit of morphine and gravel just to kind of take the edge off so you can go home, rest a bit, and then come back when you're in active labor. And we have to kind of think about timing of this because we have to think about the medication then moving across the placenta to baby, and how quickly do we think that you are for an imminent delivery, because we've got to watch how baby would then respond to that. So just things that your provider would talk to you about. And of course, the big one is the epidural, which is a needle into the back of your spine, and then sort of numbs you, if you will, or takes the sharp pain off. You'd still feel pressure, but not that sharp pain. And so something to consider as well, whether that works for you or not. So, I hope that this was a good overview for you. Unfortunately, we don't have that ability to do those one-on-one questions, but I hope that the questions that you do have, you can jot them down and take them to your provider, because these are important questions that you should have and to think through and have those dialogues with your care provider before the big day. I just wanted to thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to share this with you. And I wish you, your loved ones, your family, all the best for this journey and for welcoming this new soul onto planet Earth. May their stay be filled with light and love, and may this journey be seamless, memorable, and beautiful for you in the days and years to come. Thanks so much for having me, and I hope that you've appreciated this series brought to you in conjunction with the Health Board. Thanks very much.